It's interesting to me and that Japan continues, unfortunately, to be the leading country in terms of the infection rate. I checked before the show started, and Japan over the last few days has had over 100,000 infections. Looks like it's gone down a little bit, maybe today in the reports that are coming in so far, down in the 60,000 range. So it continues to be a factor here, but not one that seems to be materially influencing or changing behavior. Everything seems to be running as per normal, even though these numbers are so high compared to the early days of COVID. You guys all remember when we just had 3,000 infections, the country was shutting down. Any comments or observations about how Japan is handling COVID?
Yeah, I might say one thing, which is that I agree with you that, Steve, that we're coming out of COVID or trying to come out of COVID here in Japan, just like the rest of the world. But Japan's baseline is a little bit different than other countries as far as COVID protection. So I was just in Europe, and in Europe, no one wears masks. Very little social distancing. It's almost as if COVID hasn't really happened. In Japan, however, it's a completely different reality. People here still wear masks. There are still social distancing policies. You have to be careful in restaurants. There's still, plexiglass partitions in wherever you go. So, I think the measures here are very different. But despite that, I think that we're having, tourism is coming back. It's 90, at least in the Osaka area or the Kansai area, it's 90% of pre-COVID. So that's some good economic news. So, look, I think Japan is dealing with it, but there haven't been a lot of changes as far as people's behavior, but that behavior has been much more careful than in other countries where, pretty much the precautions have been disregarded in a lot of sense.
Yeah, if I had more hair to pull out of my head, I would. But what's always annoyed me is the media, and NHK does this all the time, and Japanese news does this all the time. It's almost the first news story. It's the infection rate, but the real story should be the death rate. Mm-hmm. And the death rate and the mortality rate is extremely low. And that's why here in Europe, with a death rate of 0.01%, people are basically, Jerry is completely right. People aren't even taking the fourth vaccination. The government is not saying COVID is over. But psychologically and behaviorally, people are tired of it. And if I can make one more point, Stephen, you may be interested that Hewlett-Packard bought a company called Poly for $3.3 billion just a couple of months ago. And Poly focuses in on distance, not on working at home, audio and visual, and that is really interesting. Has Japan changed its work habits? Are people still having to go to the office or obligated to go to the office? And that certainly has changed in the United States, I think fundamentally. But in Japan, I'd let the people living in Japan answer that. I would say no, or not yet. Yeah.
Taro, do you have any perspective on this? We're teaching now in person at Kansai Gaidai, and even though the numbers are high, there's no chance of interruption of that. There's no possibility of us going to online education again. But all the students wear masks in the classroom. All the professors wear masks in the classroom. My sports club just changed their policy. This is Konami, guys, the Japanese famous one. And they no longer require masks in the gym now. And guess what? 100% of the Japanese people in the gym are still wearing masks. It doesn't make any difference that the company has said no more. it's not necessary. Um, Everyone is still wearing masks. I was quite surprised to see that.
Yeah,
All right.
I just had a class yesterday that focused on the pandemic and East Asia. And then at the end of the class, I asked the students, like, what do you think of how Japan has been handling it? Have people been behaving responsibly? And then they said that they think people have been behaving responsibly, but maybe a little bit too cautious. They wish they could take off their masks like people in Europe and in the US. So I found that interesting, but I thought, yeah, so people are following all the precautions, but they're not necessarily doing so completely out of their own, what they would do otherwise. So it's maybe social pressure mostly.